Anthony Davis. You'll be here in Indianapolis on February 10th and the 11th for a series of events at the University of Indianapolis. Thank you so much for taking time to speak with me today. Huge.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah.
And I'm excited that you'll be here in Indiana. I know you visited Indiana in 1986 at DePauw University with the String Trio of New York. That's been almost 40 years ago. Have you been in Indiana since then?
I'm trying to think. Yes, I think so. I think my son played baseball in Indiana, so I think I was in Indiana.
Okay.
So he was in a minor league team actually not too far from Chicago.
So you were probably at the Victory Field in downtown Indianapolis, or was it a minor league team in Gary? They have a team as well.
Yeah, I think it was in Gary. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. But this will be your first sort of official musical
yeah.
in a while. Well, welcome back to Indiana. We're glad to have you here. You have such a unique and singular history in music making, from your early work in jazz to your work in opera and orchestral music. I'm curious what formed your musical tastes. What kind of music were you passionate about as a young person? Did you have a musical hero during your formative years? What sort of was influencing you as you were first starting to think about music?
Well, I think, in the beginning, I was a classical pianist until 10th grade. So I started playing in first grade. So I was interested. I think, Andre Watts was one of the people I looked up to as a pianist, when he made his debut with the New York Philharmonic. I remember that. And I was drawn to, also, my dad loved jazz, so I listened to as well. So I listened to Art Tatum, was a big figure early on. I used to hear Tatum's music. Then later, when it's about 10th grade, we were going to live in Italy for the year. So someone, as a joke, kind of gave my father a record, Monk in Italy, and I fell in love with the music. So Thelonious Monk was an really important early influence. And then from there in Italy, they had these wonderful record stores where you could listen to records, and they would go on a conveyor belt, and then you could listen to as many records you want before you bought one. So I fell in love with Coltrane, listening to a lot of Coltrane's music, Cannonball Adderley, Miles Davis, of course, a lot of the great artists of the 60s, then Bud Powell. Later I really got into Ellington and Mingus were very great figures in my influences. My father had a Mingus record too, so I remember really listening in the early 60s to Mingus's music. And then on the classical side of things, I was very, I loved Stravinsky and Toru Takemitsu, a great Japanese composer. I was Richard Strauss and Wagner, Kurt Weill, Bernstein. I go down the list. And it's let's see, Benjamin Britten. That was kind of later, but a lot. I began to be influenced by a lot of different music. It was later that I really got into Berg and Schoenberg.
I heard Wozzeck was the first opera you attended. Is that right? Berg's Wozzeck?
Yes, it was. Yes, It was at Yale. They did a concert version of Wozzeck, and I heard that, and that really affected me. I was really excited about it. And then, so, of course, Mozart operas too, so I started listening, and I think, certainly the jazz influences were always very strong. Listening a lot to the whole breadth of Ellington's music, and I think Mingus has been an enduring influence on my music.
I mentioned your early work in jazz music. As a young man, you were recording and performing alongside really heavyweight names in jazz: Oliver Lake, Marion Brown, Reggie Workman, Andrew Surreal, Leroy Jenkins, and on and on and on. I'm curious if at that point in your life in the 70s, as a young musician, did you perceive yourself as a jazz musician? Or did you have the ambition to write orchestral works and operas? How did you sort of perceive yourself at that point in your life as a musician?
Well, I always had the ambition to write operas and large-scale works. That's something I thought about when I was in 10th grade. You know, I was really interested in the opera as a form, and something I would eventually like to do. But I also love improvising. I love being in improvising ensembles, and that was a great time. I think a big influence in my early days was Wadada Leo Smith, who's lived in New Haven when I was a student at Yale, and so I started playing with him and introduced to his concepts of acrovention, notation system, all these things, and I was very interested in the integration of improvisation into more complex compositional structures, and so I think being introduced to many of the members of the ACM, I was associated with I knew Anthony Braxton and Roscoe Mitchell and Henry Threadgill, as well as the musicians I really played with, like Leroy Jenkins and Wadada, and so that was a big influence for me. Cecil Taylor was someone I met, and was a kind of mentor for me when I first came to New York, and he was I think a very important figure for me as a musician.
Yeah, I do want to ask about your work as an opera composer and your works in orchestral music. But first, I want to ask you about a couple musicians here in Indianapolis. A lot of my work as a music journalist revolves around researching music history here in Indiana. And Indianapolis produced a couple figures who were really pioneers in breaking barriers between jazz and classical music. I'm talking about David Baker and J.J. Johnson. J.J. Johnson was very involved in the early third stream movement, and David Baker wrote many orchestral works and chamber pieces. Did their work have any meaning to you? Did you ever happen to meet them? Anything you want to share about J.J. or David Baker?
I think I met David Baker. I'm not sure if I remember J. I certainly loved his playing, and I knew J.J.'s playing, and it was a very important musician in this, particularly around the '60s, and as a trombone player, and both of them were originally trombone players, and David Baker as well. His teaching and being involved with third stream music, it was very important. And I was very interested in writing for Sean Bowen because of George Lewis was in college with me. So we had a band together. So I was always writing music for and George, of course, knew all the trombone literature like that. So I think that they're very, very important people in terms of the music and the new direction in music. I remember listening a lot to the Concert of Modern Music from that they did in Brandeis in the 50s with Gunther Schuller put together with featured one piece by Mingus and John Carisi, and of course George Russell too was a very, very important figure in that.
Yeah, a lot of Indianapolis musicians spent time in George Russell's band. Interesting.
Yeah,
including.
That's very. Yeah, very interesting band. He had really interesting, and I love Eric Dolphy. Eric Dolphy was a very, also in George Russell's bands, and but played with everyone from Ornette to Coltrane, and then had his own music. And also meeting a great composer, Hale Smith, who also was a close friend of Eric Dolphy's.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Davis, in 1986, your opera X, The Life and Times of Malcolm X, was premiered by the New York City Opera. This was a groundbreaking and monumental work in the history of American music. And I think it's interesting to point out that your opera came 5 or 6 years before Spike Lee's film, Malcolm X, which kind of mainstreamed Malcolm X as a historical figure for a lot of Americans. I think when you wrote the opera X, he was still very much a subversive and for some people, a dangerous and radical figure, very controversial in his lifetime. I'm curious how you settled on this concept of composing a work about Malcolm X, and did you get any pushback at that time? Did people think this was maybe not an acceptable subject for an opera?
Well, I think I came up to the idea actually with one of the things. My brother was in a play called El Hajj Malik playing Malcolm X, and so I remember in New Haven they did a performance of it. I went to the play, and he was very excited. He came backstage and said, "Well, you should think about doing an opera, a musical about Malcolm X, because there are so many references to music in the autobiography." And Malcolm was so much around the music. I mean, when he was working the dance halls in Boston and New York, and even when he was doing, his speeches, for example, Billy Taylor told me the story, the wonderful jazz pianist, and had his radio show on, I think it was probably WBAI in New York. And Malcolm would give his speech every week on WBAI on the radio. And then there was a jazz show after it. So literally, this is in the 60s, Billy Taylor would be talking and presenting, Coltrane and Miles and, great Sonny Rollins and great musicians of that time. And he said Malcolm would always stay to hear the music. So I think that's interesting. So his life was, I felt, could be told through music. And there's something really a deep connection for Malcolm and music. And then also thinking him as a figure, to me, he was a tragic hero. He was a person who was ahead of his time, who had a message, who evolved. I mean, his evolution is if we look at all the name changes from Malcolm Little to Malcolm X to El Hajj Malik. So what I was thinking is, and when my brother, and I worked with my brother and Talani on the opera. Talani, my cousin, wrote the libretto. And my brother created the story. And in creating the story, he thought each act would be a name change. Each act would represent, his transformation. So the first act is Malcolm Little becomes Detroit Red. Second act, Detroit Red becomes Malcolm X. The third act, Malcolm X becomes El Hajj Malik El Shabazz. So that was a very neat way of portraying his spiritual odyssey. How he transformed. So I thought it was a universal story, a powerful story. Certainly with controversy. I mean, there was some producers who didn't want to have anything to do with X. And as we know, with the huge success it was at New York City Opera in 1986, how many years it took to be revived again. It took years before it was done in Detroit and eventually at the Met last year. So it was over 30 years between in time. So I think that it was a big statement because in a way it was looking at Malcolm X is in American history as a kind of heroic figure, a tragic hero. In a way, for me, as a musical figure, it's like my Siegfried. It's a way in which I could tell the story of my people or the story of the evolution of our political thought through music.
That must have been a huge turning point in your life and in the trajectory of your career. How did that change sort of your fortunes as a composer and musician after the opera was staged in 86? Did that change things for you?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I mean, my focus shifted from, performance and it was a slow process, but really my primary focus has been on opera, composing opera. And, I've written, orchestra music and large chamber music, clarinet concerto I did for Anthony McGill, on other pieces. But I think, a lot of my focus has been on opera. And once I did the one opera, I couldn't wait to do another one. Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned the revival of X at the Metropolitan Opera. I think it was 2023.
Right.
Which is amazing. A lot of operas don't have a long life, a lot of contemporary operas that are composed. I read an interesting quote from David Baker recently, to mention David again. He actually had experimented with the idea of writing an opera about Malcolm X in collaboration with Mari Evans, a very important poet and writer here in Indianapolis. He was discouraged to do it by one of his colleagues at Indiana University, who was a composer. He told David, you'll spend 3 or 4 years writing this piece, and if you're lucky, it'll get performed once or twice and then just be, on the shelf for the rest of your life. Did anybody come to you with any warnings like that? And what do you make of the longevity of this piece and your ability to continue writing for this medium, which a lot of living composers haven't had a lot of success in?
Well, I think that I didn't really think of it that way. I mean, I'm certainly people, warnings about, devoting your life to doing opera. It's certainly, it can be perilous. But I felt that Malcolm's story had to be told, and it had to be done, and it was important for not only classical music, but the African American community to represent that, and to make opera into a different kind of form. It also meant transforming the form itself. Making opera into something that also, I don't think you could tell Malcolm's story without looking at African American music. Looking at the music, looking at, particularly the jazz music and avant-garde jazz music of the 60s that was so tied to Malcolm X. When I remember so much hearing Archie Shepp play, and so many musicians, or listening to Coltrane's Alabama, or something. So I think that it's, and it's certainly Charles Mingus's Meditations on Integration, so many pieces of his. So I felt that there was something that I felt a responsibility as an artist to bring those stories into opera, and also to transform opera into something that represents Black music.
Yeah. One last question on Malcolm X. He was one of the most unique and recognizable orators in the history of the English language. He had such a distinctive cadence and timing in his delivery when he spoke.
Right.
As a composer, when you're writing a work like X, are you thinking about the real life character of Malcolm X, how he spoke when you're writing, or are you sort of inventing your own universe where those things don't necessarily apply?
Well, I think very much so. I mean, I remember there are some parts of it that are more about his spiritual life, what his inner thoughts are, like with his correspondence with Elijah Muhammad in Act 2, Scene 1, and where you see he evolves from, this kind of disheartened person who's in prison into embracing the Nation of Islam. So that spiritual odyssey was really important. But then when he becomes that street preacher in Harlem, and he's working 125th Street and Lenox Avenue, I thought I listened a lot to Malcolm's speeches. Exactly what you said, his speech rhythms, his cadence. And when I started listening to him, and of course I had listened to Martin Luther King as well. And if I were looking at musical correlatives, like Martin Luther King's like Coltrane, and Malcolm X is like Miles. It's that mercurial, lightning fast way of changing direction, using space, how he spoke. So I purposely created this kind of interaction with the voice, in which the voice is almost like the way Miles might have been playing. It's mostly like post Bridges Brew Miles that I was thinking of when I did work with his speeches and how he addressed the public, and to have that kind of rhythmic interplay and exchange, and also his quick wit, his humor, that was really important thing to me. So, but then also at the same time show his inner side, his vulnerability. When he was expelled from the Nation of Islam and silenced, and then he makes his pilgrimage to Mecca. It's the scenes with Betty are different kinds of scenes, and so to reveal more of the inner Malcolm and not just the public persona.
Mr. Davis, you always find fascinating and important subject matter to explore in your work, from X to Tanya to Amistad to the Central Park Five. I want to ask you about your opera, The Central Park Five. In 2020, you won a Pulitzer Prize for the piece. The opera focuses on the fate of the Central Park Five, a group of 5 Black and Latino men who were wrongly convicted in 1989 of assaulting a jogger in New York Central Park. Their case was highly politicized. The current president of the United States, Donald Trump, inserted himself into this case and was very outspoken about it during the 1980s. And Trump is a character in the opera. What inspired you to create an opera around this work? And I want to ask you about the current political climate in America after that. But first of all, just what moved you to write this piece?
Well, I think it was what was very funny is I was talking to Kevin Maynard, who runs Trilogy, an opera company in Newark, and we're talking about projects I might do. And I was actually considering doing something completely different. And he sent me this libretto that Richard Risley had written about the Central Park Five, and asking me to recommend a composer to write the music for it. And so when I read the libretto, I said, yeah, I can recommend, I'll recommend me. Because I lived in New York during that time in 1989. And I thought that was a great story to tell. Also a cautionary tale about the political rise of Trump. Trump I think, exploited the Central Park Five for his own personal and political gain. And, putting full-page ads in the newspaper, support our police, bring back the death penalty. So, and also he's never apologized to the Five, and he still was demonizing the Five as late as, his, recent election, or certainly in 2016 when he was running for president. So I was very interested in exploring that. Also, 89 was interesting in terms of culture because it's like the arrival of hip hop as in the mainstream American culture. And so I looked at a lot of why the motivation behind the demonizing of those Five when they said they were wilding in the park, for example. Now, wilding actually comes from the song they were singing, which was Tone Loc's Wild Thing, that they heard as wilding. So that became wilding in the park. So what it was is this anxiety about hip hop being part of the mainstream of American culture, and was a cultural thing. And also, if you understand Trump as a landlord on the west side of Manhattan, on the west side of Central Park. So Central Park is the meeting place between Harlem and the west side and the east side, and so those things were all also about his financial interests, So I was very fascinated with that whole thing and the political underpinnings of it, and also the emergence of hip hop. So there's a section that's inspired by hip hop in the opera when they go into the park, and they're singing. And I used a very took a P-Funk song as kind of I did variations on that as they go into the park. I mean, in the tradition of how sampling's used in hip hop, but I use more parody of the musical form, and what they sing, those in pitches, is something of an MC might say, but done in rhythmically, but done in music. So I was very interested in that cult. It's very interesting cultural moment, and America and the anxiety about hip hop and about how that was mainstream culture, and they are certainly not also the anxiety toward gangster rap and all the other thing, the other forms that merged.
Do you know if any of the Central Park Five were able to see the work, or any of their family? Do you have a sense of what their reaction was to this piece? I mean, it must have been very surreal for them.
I met them all. I went to, they had a luncheon with the ACLU in Los Angeles when we were in production doing the Central Park 5 in Long Beach. That was the production. And so the whole cast of my opera, all the people who played the 5, went to LA, and also the cast of the TNT movie that was done about Central Park 5 were there, and we all met the 5. So there was 15 people. they had to be, yes, and I got to talk a lot with Yusef Salaam, and I had met Yusef's sister before. So I hope in the new production, we're doing a new production in Detroit with the orchestra. I hope that some of them can come to that, and we were trying to hopefully bring the production into New York and Atlanta, which many of the 5 live in Atlanta now.
That's amazing. And Mr. Davis, I mentioned Trump as a character in the Central Park 5 opera. You've never been afraid to address social and political themes in your work. Sometimes that can be a bold or dangerous thing to do. Right now, we're hearing a lot of rhetoric from the president about retribution against political critics and dissidents. I mean, you laughed. Does that scare you at all, either as an academic or as a very prominent musical figure who is critiquing power in this country? What do you make of this current political moment? Do you have any?
Well, I think it's like 1930 in Germany. I mean, that's where we are. I mean, we're seeing the dawning of fascism in America, and that's that's dangerous. We don't have the constraints. We don't have Congress that's willing to stand up or resist. I mean, I blame the Democratic Party too, because I don't think they've made a strong enough statement of resistance. But I think if they're not willing to do it, we have to do it. And so it reminds me so much with Kurt Weill and Bertolt Brecht doing Mahagoni in 1930. It's what it feels like, and the idea. But I think that unless we push against it, unless we resist it, I mean, we'll no one to blame but ourselves. So I think it's very important to push against it, and to also realize that he is attempting to demonize Black people and people LGBTQ people, transgender people, all that in a way to divide us, and in a way also it's like the first step of fascism. You condemn someone, you demonize people, and that should be resisted on every level. I mean, and I think, he's also they're trying to erase history. When they talk about critical race theory and their critique of critical race theory, what they're talking about is that he doesn't want us to talk about things that make us uncomfortable. Like the Tulsa Race Massacre in Oklahoma, for example. There's so many examples of what institutional racism has wrought in our country, and what has happened, since the Civil War. I mean, after all, what was the model for Hitler? The model for Hitler was America. The model for Hitler was Jim Crow. So we know what that means, and we know what that applies. So I think it's important for us to stand up. It's important to us to be part of the resistance, and to support people who are resisting these efforts, and support people, transgender people, support LGBTQ people, as well as African Americans and immigrants. I'm writing a new opera about immigration called Pancho Rabbit and the Coe, which I'll address that. But I think it's because to me, this is life and death. This is the life and death of our country, our democracy, the life and death of our society. That whether we will have our freedom, all those things. And there's a lot of scary things happening. Musk is has access to all the Treasury Department records. So, what are they going to do? They're going to, they're going to audit every person who poses them politically. That's a potential there. But I think, this is something I think we have to be active and push against the what's coming.
I was listening to some of the Brecht and Weil classic works recently, and it is chilling to revisit them now. And it's really frightening to think that Brecht escaped Germany to face the House Committee of Un-American Activities. Yeah, and that used to seem like such a distant and foreign idea to me, this House Committee of Un-American Activities. It doesn't seem so distant anymore.
My father had to testify, so I know. My father was blacklisted.
Wow.
So no, I know that this is real. I mean, it's happened before. During the McCarthy era. It was an assault on universities and on it was also anti-Semitic in many respects. So I think and my father had to testify in the Remington trial. He was accused of being a spy for the Soviet Union, so because my father and Remington ran a student organization in Dartmouth that was for free Spain, against Franco and the fascists. So, but I think that's kind of been my DNA. It's definitely is. My father would. It's in mine too.
I want to end on a lighter note quickly before we go. I wanted to ask you about a piece you wrote with Arnold Weinstein titled Tupelo. This just sounds unbelievable to me. I think it was based on the life of Elvis Presley.
Elvis.
Country music tunes for this piece. Is that right?
Yep. Yeah, but I tried what I tried, and it's so funny you bring that up. In the musical, I tried to write music and creating the characters in Elvis's life that represented the different genres of music that influenced him, from gospel quartet, which would be the chorus, to which he loved gospel quartets. He had hundreds of gospel quartet records. Certainly the rockabilly music to, Hank Williams, Dottie Wells, earlier country styles, as well as, someone like Ray Charles, for example. What would Elvis, imagine what Elvis would have been like in the future? Who would his musical models have been? And I think Ray Charles was a very significant figure too. So, and then, so basically writing a piece that looks at all these different forms of the blues, and telling Elvis's story. And it was really interesting. Arnold he writes that he was an amazing lyricist, So, and also it was a wonderful time. I mean, I remember Arnold lived in the Chelsea Hotel in New York. So I go to the Chelsea and Bill Bolcom let me his apartment. So I would go stay at Bill Bolcom's apartment in the Chelsea, and then go to Arnold's, and what we do is listen to like a record of Pine Top Smith or something, or listen to country music, and then Arnold would have these lyrics, and I would just respond to it. Okay, I'll write a song that's influenced by this, and so it was really fun. I mean, we literally, like the old fashioned thing, and write 4 songs a day. Okay, sit in a hotel room and do that. No, so that was really interesting. I'm not sure what will ever happen with that piece, but it certainly influenced me in my other work. I have a musical now I'm working on called Shimmer. That's takes place during the McCarthy period of the Blacklist, and sort of about that period of time, and in post World War II, takes place in 1947, and so in that I really it really brings out all those things of also reacting to the music that was popular at the time, from Nat King Cole to the jazz of that period. So, but that's something I like to do. Sometimes I like to zone in on different periods of time and absorb it and try to try to find ways of connecting in my own music.
And Mr. Davis, you'll be here in Indianapolis at the University of Indianapolis on February 10th and 11th. You have some great events planned here, some performance of your works. You're going to be in conversation with a friend of mine, Joshua Thompson, who I know you appeared on his podcast a couple years ago, Melanated Moments with Angela Brown. Anything you want to say before we go about your upcoming visit to Indiana?
No, I'm very looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to the concert. They're doing a concert of my music as well. And I'm really looking forward to meeting people. And I wish I could go see a Pacer game. I love basketball. Yeah. I'm a devout Knicks fan, so the Pacers are they're like a real rival. You know, last year they beat us in the playoffs. So I mean, what can I say?
Well, hopefully they'll be in town while you're here. Thank you so much for taking time to speak with me today. When I was a teenager, I found a copy of your cassette, The Ghost Factory, in a cutout bin, and I've been fascinated with your work ever since.
Oh, that's funny.
I'm a big fan, so thank you for taking time to...
nice to meet you. Yeah, thank you.
Appreciate it, and hope to see you in Indy.
I hope to see you too.